I stepped into the house that Tuesday evening, my arms full of groceries and a bottle of champagne I'd splurged on to celebrate our 20th anniversary next week, and found Frank sitting at the dining table with his hands folded like he was waiting for a business meeting to start. The look on his face made my stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. No smile, no greeting, just that cold, rehearsed expression I'd seen him use with clients he was about to fire. He said it without preamble, without softening the blow, like he was reading from a script he'd practiced in the mirror. "I want a divorce, Clara. I've met someone else, someone who makes me feel young again." The champagne bottle slipped from my fingers and shattered on the hardwood floor we'd refinished together 5 years ago, the golden liquid spreading like blood across the kitchen threshold. But let me take you back 3 months, to when I still believed my marriage was solid, when I still thought love could survive anything, when I was still blind to the earthquake building beneath my feet. 3 months earlier, I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror in our Chicago brownstone, smoothing moisturizer onto my face and thinking about how 45 looked different than I'd imagined when I was 25. The lines around my eyes didn't bother me. They were laugh lines, evidence of 2 decades of smiling at terrible dad jokes and kids' piano recitals and Sunday morning pancakes. I touched the crow's feet at the corners of my eyes, traced the faint vertical line between my brows that appeared when I concentrated too hard on design mock-ups or worried about the kids' grades. My mother used to say that every wrinkle told a story, and mine were all about love and laughter and living a full life. I had no idea then that someone else was reading those same lines as evidence of obsolescence, as proof that I'd outlived my usefulness in my own marriage. Frank came up behind me and kissed my shoulder, told me I looked beautiful, and I believed him because why wouldn't I? We'd built this life brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, dream by postponed dream. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who'd aged just as much as I had, gray at the temples, deeper lines around his mouth, but somehow on him it read as distinguished rather than expired. I remember turning around and kissing him properly, tasting coffee and toothpaste, feeling the familiar comfort of his arms around my waist. How was I supposed to know that his mind was already somewhere else, with someone else, planning an exit strategy while holding me close enough to feel my heartbeat? I'd left my position at a boutique design firm when our daughter Emma was born, telling myself it was temporary, that I'd go back when the kids were older. The firm had been small but prestigious, working with high-end clients on branding and interior concepts that challenged my creativity and paid well enough to make me feel independent. I remember my last day, packing up my desk while 7 months pregnant, my boss Margaret hugging me and saying the door would always be open. I'd believed that too. Believed so many things back then that turned out to be beautiful lies I told myself to make the sacrifices feel worthwhile. Then came our son Michael 3 years later, and temporary became permanent, and my career became something I used to do, back when I was someone else. But I told myself it was worth it, that being there for every soccer game and science fair and middle-of-the-night fever was the kind of wealth you couldn't put a price on. I was building a family, and family was everything, right? I was the room mom, the PTA volunteer, the one who organized the bake sales and remembered everyone's birthdays and made sure the house was a home and not just a place where people slept between obligations. I told myself I was choosing this, that it was empowerment to decide that my children needed me more than the design world did. And maybe it was true, or maybe I was already learning to gaslight myself, practicing the mental gymnastics that would let me ignore so many red flags later on. Frank's architecture firm was thriving, pulling in serious money, his net worth climbing steadily as Chicago's real estate market boomed. He'd started the firm with 2 partners 10 years ago, working out of a cramped office above a Vietnamese restaurant in Pilsen, taking on any project they could get just to keep the lights on. I'd helped in those early days, doing their branding for free, designing their website, networking at events while wearing thrift store dresses, and pretending we weren't one bad month away from bankruptcy. But they'd made it, caught the wave of Chicago's downtown revitalization, landed bigger and bigger projects until Frank's name was on buildings across the city. He'd always been the breadwinner, and I'd been fine with that arrangement, proud even, watching him succeed while I held down the home front. We had a beautiful 3-story brownstone in Lincoln Park, the kind of place I used to walk past as a struggling designer and dream about owning someday. The house had been a disaster when we bought it 12 years ago, pipes bursting and floors sagging and wallpaper peeling in sheets like sunburned skin. We'd renovated it ourselves, mostly. Frank drawing up the plans and me choosing every finish and fixture, spending weekends covered in dust and paint while the kids ran around the construction zone like it was the world's best playground. Every room held memories of us working together, building something beautiful from ruins. And I'd thought that was a metaphor for our marriage, that we were the kind of team that could weather anything. We had college funds for the kids, a decent retirement account, enough income that we could take nice vacations and not worry too much about the cost. Last summer, we'd gone to Croatia, rented a villa on the Adriatic coast, and spent 2 weeks swimming in turquoise water and eating grilled fish and pretending we were the kind of sophisticated international travelers we'd always aspired to be. Emma had loved the medieval towns, taking thousands of photos for her Instagram, and Michael had learned to paddleboard and flirted with a German girl staying at the neighboring villa. Frank and I had held hands walking along the ancient city walls of Dubrovnik, and I'd thought about how lucky we were, how rare it was to still like each other after 20 years, how many of our friends were already divorced or miserably coexisting. On paper, we looked perfect, the kind of couple other people envied at neighborhood gatherings and school fundraisers. I know what you're thinking right now, that I should have seen it coming, that there must have been signs I was ignoring. But love doesn't make you blind, it makes you trusting. And trust is the most dangerous drug in the world when the person you're trusting is already planning your betrayal. The first crack appeared on a Saturday in late April. Frank said he was meeting a client to discuss a new commercial project downtown, some high-rise development that could bring in serious profit. He kissed me goodbye around 10 in the morning, told me he'd be back for dinner, and I spent the day gardening in our backyard, pulling weeds and planting tomatoes, and thinking about nothing more complicated than whether the weather would hold. The sun was warm on my shoulders, the soil rich and dark under my fingernails, and I remember feeling deeply content, grounded in the simple pleasure of making things grow. I texted Frank around 3 to ask if he wanted salmon or chicken for dinner, and he responded an hour later with just salmon, no emoji, no love you, just the bare minimum of communication. He came home at 8, smelling like expensive perfume, and when I mentioned it, he laughed it off, said the client was a woman who wore too much fragrance and hugged everyone. The laugh was wrong, though, too loud and too quick. The laugh of someone who'd prepared for this exact question and had his answer ready. I believed him because I'd built my entire adult life on believing him, on trusting that the man I'd married at 25 was still the same man at 47. That night in bed, he turned away from me when I reached for him, said he was tired, and I told myself it was work stress, the pressure of running a successful business, nothing personal. I lay there in the dark, listening to him breathe, feeling the first whisper of unease curl in my stomach like smoke. But I pushed it down, told myself I was being paranoid, that everything was fine. How many warning signs do we ignore because seeing them would mean admitting our entire reality is crumbling? It's like those optical illusions where once you see the hidden image, you can't unsee it. But in reverse, you're desperately trying to unsee what's right in front of your face, because seeing it would mean your whole world is a lie. Chapter 2 began with me trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Frank started working later, coming home at 9 or 10 o'clock, sometimes smelling like wine or that same cloying perfume. It was a floral scent, heavy and sweet, something expensive but cliched. The kind of fragrance a young woman would choose trying to seem sophisticated. I'd catch it on his collar when I was sorting laundry, that ghost of someone else clinging to my husband's clothes, marking territory I'd thought was exclusively mine. When I asked about it, he got defensive, accused me of being paranoid, said I was turning into one of those suspicious wives who couldn't handle their husbands having female colleagues. The gaslighting was subtle at first, just small comments here and there about how I was being irrational, how I needed to trust him more, how my insecurity was pushing him away. He'd say things like, "You're really going to start a fight over nothing," I thought you were more mature than this. Or, maybe if you spent more time on yourself and less time inventing problems, you'd be happier. Each comment was a tiny knife, small enough that I couldn't quite justify being wounded. But they accumulated, death by 1,000 cuts, until I started questioning my own perceptions. Have you ever felt yourself going crazy, questioning your own perceptions, wondering if the problem is actually you? That's what gaslighting does. It makes you doubt the evidence of your own senses, turns you into a detective in your own life, searching for proof that you're not losing your mind. I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The way he angled his phone screen away from me when he was texting, turning it face down on the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. The new clothes that appeared in his closet without any shopping bags coming home, expensive shirts and shoes I'd never seen him buy, and when I asked about them, he'd say dismissively that he'd picked them up weeks ago, implying I was unobservant for not noticing sooner. There was the weekend conference in Milwaukee that seemed to require an awful lot of overnight preparation. Frank left on a Thursday afternoon for a conference that didn't officially start until Saturday morning, claiming he wanted to get there early and do some networking. He'd never been the networking type before, had always complained about industry events and schmoozing, but suddenly he was enthusiastic about conference small talk and mixer drinks. I helped him pack, folded his shirts, and reminded him to bring his phone charger, played the supportive wife, while something cold and sharp twisted in my chest. He kissed me goodbye on the front porch, said he'd miss me, and I watched his car disappear down the tree-lined street and wondered when exactly I'd become the kind of woman who doubted everything her husband said. I found the first real clue on a Thursday afternoon while doing laundry. A receipt fell out of his jacket pocket, from a restaurant in River North I'd never heard of, dated from the previous Tuesday when he'd supposedly been working late at the office. The receipt was crumpled, like he'd shoved it in his pocket and forgotten about it, and it showed a timestamp of 8:30 p.m. The total was over $300, 2 entrees, 2 glasses of wine, 1 dessert to share. The dessert detail killed me somehow, more than the expensive steaks or the wine, because sharing dessert is intimate, romantic, the kind of thing you do on a date, not at a business dinner. I held that receipt in my hands for 20 minutes, sitting on the edge of our bed, trying to manufacture an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a business dinner. Maybe the client had expensive taste. Maybe I was reading too much into a piece of paper that proved nothing except that my husband had eaten an expensive meal without me. But the metallic taste of fear was already in my mouth. That copper penny flavor that comes when your body knows something your mind isn't ready to accept. My hands were shaking, making the receipt flutter like a trapped butterfly. And I remember thinking very clearly that this was the moment, the crossroads where I had to choose between ignorance and truth. I put the receipt back in his jacket and said nothing, telling myself I needed more evidence before I made accusations I couldn't take back. But I also took a photo of it with my phone, zoomed in on every detail, the date and time and itemized list, the credit card number partially obscured. I created a secret folder on my phone labeled Home Renovation Ideas and started collecting evidence I hoped I'd never need. The neighborhood barbecue happened 3 weeks later, on a sunny Saturday in May when the whole block gathered in the Hendersons' backyard for grilled burgers and cold beer and the kind of casual socializing that makes Chicago summers bearable. The Hendersons had lived on our street for 30 years, had watched the neighborhood transform from working-class Irish families to young professionals, to the current mix of established families like ours and tech workers cashing in on Chicago's startup boom. Their backyard was huge by city standards, with a deck and a pool and enough space for 50 people to mill around without feeling crowded. I was standing by the potato salad table, making small talk with Susan from 2 doors down, when Gary Mitchell approached me with a beer in one hand and that loose-lipped friendliness that comes from day drinking in the sun. Susan had been talking about her kitchen renovation, the nightmare of living without a functioning stove for 6 weeks, and I was half listening, making sympathetic noises while scanning the crowd for Emma and Michael. Gary worked with Frank, had been at the firm for maybe 8 years, and I'd always found him pleasant in that superficial way you find your spouse's colleagues pleasant. His wife had left him 2 years ago, some drama about growing apart and wanting different things, and he'd been doing the divorced dad thing ever since, alternating between seeming lost and seeming relieved. He asked how I was doing, said he hadn't seen me in a while, and then, like he was commenting on the weather, mentioned how nice it must have been for Frank to finally take that trip to Napa Valley he'd been planning. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs, because Frank hadn't taken any trip to Napa Valley. Or if he had, I certainly hadn't been invited. My vision tunneled for a second, the sunny backyard shrinking to just Gary's sunburned face and oblivious smile, and I felt Susan's hand on my elbow, steadying me. I managed to smile, managed to say something non-committal about how busy we'd both been, but inside I was screaming, drowning, falling through space with nothing to grab onto. Gary kept talking, oblivious to the bomb he'd just dropped, mentioning something about wine tastings and beautiful weather and how the photos looked amazing. Photos. There were photos. Frank had been documenting his romantic getaway while I was home, folding his laundry and making sure his kids did their homework. When he wandered off to refill his beer, I stood there frozen, watching Frank across the yard laughing with a group of neighbors, and felt the last threads of denial snap inside my chest. This wasn't my imagination, wasn't paranoia or insecurity or hormones making me crazy. My husband of 20 years, the father of my children, the man I'd sacrificed my career for, had taken a romantic vacation with another woman and lied to my face about it. I tried to remember where he'd told me he was that weekend, scrolled back through my mental calendar, and realized it was the Milwaukee conference, the one he'd left for early on Thursday. He hadn't been in Milwaukee at all. He'd been in Napa Valley, drinking wine and taking photos with someone who wasn't his wife. The humiliation was a living thing, crawling under my skin. Because how many of these people knew? How many of them had seen Frank with her, had been in on the joke while I played the oblivious wife at home? I looked around the backyard, at all these neighbors I'd known for years, and wondered who else was keeping his secret, who else knew that Clara Johnson's perfect marriage was a facade. Susan was looking at me with concern now, asking if I was okay, and I lied and said I was fine, just a little dizzy from the heat, and excused myself to go find some water. I left the barbecue early, told Susan I had a headache, which wasn't even a lie because my skull felt like it was splitting open. At home, I sat in our bedroom, the room where we'd conceived our children and argued about paint colors and made love on lazy Sunday mornings, and looked around at the life I thought I'd built. Every piece of furniture, every framed photo, every carefully chosen throw pillow suddenly felt like a prop in a play I hadn't realized I was performing in. The wedding photo on the dresser showed two young people grinning at each other like they'd won the lottery, and I wanted to reach into that photograph and warn that girl. Tell her to keep her career and her independence and her ability to survive without this man who would one day discard her for someone younger. The claustrophobia was suffocating, the walls closing in, the air too thick to breathe. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to burn it all down, but instead I just sat there in the silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant laughter from the barbecue still going on without me. A betrayal this deep doesn't heal. It scars over, and you spend the rest of your life trying not to touch the tender places. Emma came home around sunset, found me still sitting in the bedroom, and asked what was wrong. She was 16 then, perceptive and emotionally intelligent in that way teenage girls can be, and she knew immediately that something was off. I wanted to tell her everything, to unload this horrible weight onto someone who would understand and be outraged on my behalf. But she was still his daughter, and destroying her image of her father felt cruel, like I'd be making her a casualty in a war she didn't start. So I lied again, said I wasn't feeling well, probably coming down with something, and she brought me water and aspirin and sat on the edge of the bed, telling me about the barbecue, about how Michael had won the water balloon toss, and how Dad had seemed distracted. Even she'd noticed, this teenager caught up in her own world of school and friends and drama, had picked up on Frank's distance, his preoccupation with whatever life he was living, separate from us. Chapter 3 was when I stopped crying and started hunting. I know you're probably wondering why I didn't just confront him right then. Why I didn't throw his clothes on the lawn and change the locks and call a divorce attorney. But here's what they don't tell you about betrayal. It paralyzes you. Part of me still wanted to be wrong. Still hoped there was some explanation that would make all of this make sense and let me go back to my comfortable denial. Maybe Gary had been confused. Maybe Frank had been talking about a future trip to Napa Valley. Maybe the receipt was from a business dinner, and I was connecting dots that didn't form a picture. But a bigger part of me, the part that was slowly waking up from 20 years of sleep, knew I needed ammunition. If this was going to end, and it was going to end, I needed to control the narrative, needed to have so much proof that Frank couldn't gaslight his way out of it. I'd seen enough divorce horror stories from friends and acquaintances to know that going into battle unprepared was suicide. I needed documentation, evidence, irrefutable proof that would hold up in court and in the court of public opinion. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Detective Sarah Chen, who came recommended by a divorce attorney I'd looked up online. I'd found the attorney through a Google search at 2 a.m, sitting in the bathroom with my laptop because I couldn't sleep and couldn't stand lying next to Frank for one more second. The attorney's website had testimonials from women who'd been in my position, women who'd felt powerless and ended up taking back control, and I'd sent an email asking for a consultation before I could talk myself out of it. Sarah was in her 50s, matter-of-fact and professional, and she didn't judge me when I broke down crying in her office, didn't tell me to just leave him or stand up for myself, or any of the useless advice people give when they've never been in your position. Her office was in a nondescript building in the Loop, the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing, and it smelled like coffee and old files and the faint chemical scent of photo-developing solution. She'd been a Chicago PD detective for 20 years before going private, specializing in domestic cases, infidelity investigations, and she'd seen it all, every variation of human betrayal, every excuse and lie and desperate attempt to have it both ways. Sarah listened to my story, took notes in a leather-bound notebook, and asked questions that felt invasive but necessary. How long had I suspected? What evidence did I have? Did Frank have access to significant assets? Was there any history of violence? She was building a picture, understanding not just what Frank was doing, but what kind of man he was, what tactics he might use if confronted, how dangerous this might get. When I showed her the receipt and told her about Gary's comment about Napa Valley, she nodded like she'd seen this exact scenario 100 times before. She quoted me a rate that made me wince, $1,500 a day plus expenses, but told me most cases wrapped up within a week or two, that cheaters were usually sloppy because they didn't think they'd get caught. Sarah started following Frank, documenting his movements, photographing him with her. Her name was Melissa, 28 years old, worked as a marketing coordinator at a firm Frank's company had hired for a big project. Sarah's first report included a full background check on Melissa, born and raised in suburban Minneapolis, moved to Chicago for college and never left. Worked in marketing for 3 different companies in 5 years. No criminal record, no marriage, no kids. She looked like every other ambitious young professional in Chicago, someone trying to make it in the city, networking and climbing and figuring out who she wanted to be. Except she'd decided that part of who she wanted to be was the other woman in a married man's life. And that made her complicit, made her just as responsible for the destruction she was helping to cause. Sarah's reports came in weekly, each one a knife to the gut. Lunch dates at expensive restaurants, Frank and Melissa sitting close in booths, meant for romance, not business, her hand on his arm, his eyes never leaving her face. Evening drinks at hotel bars, the kind of upscale places with low lighting and leather chairs where people go when they want to be seen being sophisticated. Weekend trips disguised as business conferences, surveillance photos of them checking into boutique hotels in Milwaukee, Detroit, even a weekend in Nashville that Frank had told me was a solo trip to visit a college friend. There were photos of them holding hands walking along the Riverwalk, Chicago's skyline glittering behind them like a backdrop in a romantic movie. Kissing in the parking garage of his office building, Frank's hand tangled in her hair, her body pressed against his car. The kind of passionate kiss you give someone when you can't wait to get them alone. Checking into a boutique hotel in Wicker Park, a trendy place I'd always wanted to try for a special occasion. And I wondered if Frank had remembered that I'd mentioned it, if he'd deliberately chosen it as some kind of sick joke, or if he'd just forgotten I existed at all. Each image was proof, undeniable and devastating, that my marriage had been a corpse for months and I'd been too loyal to notice the smell. I kept the reports in a locked filing cabinet in the basement, in a folder labeled Tax Documents 2019. And every time I added a new one, I felt like I was documenting my own autopsy, collecting evidence of a death that had already occurred, but nobody had bothered to inform me about. The financial investigation was almost worse. I started going through our bank statements, credit card bills, investment accounts, all the money I'd never paid much attention to, because Frank handled it, and I trusted him. Trust, that word again, the foundation everything was built on, and the thing that had made me vulnerable to this complete destruction of my life. I set up a separate laptop in my closet, hidden behind shoeboxes, and spent hours going through years of financial records, looking for patterns, following the money trail that would show me exactly how long I'd been a fool. He'd been spending thousands of dollars on her, fancy dinners and hotel rooms and jewelry I never received, all of it funded by the income we'd built together, the business success I'd supported by taking care of everything else so he could focus on his career. There were charges to Tiffany's, multiple purchases over several months, and I checked my own jewelry box and found nothing new, which meant everything he'd bought had gone to her. Flowers delivered to an address I didn't recognize, probably her apartment. A weekend car rental for a BMW convertible, because apparently his Tesla wasn't good enough for impressing his girlfriend. There were transfers to a separate account I didn't have access to, money being siphoned away from our joint finances into what I could only assume was his escape fund, his preparation for the divorce he was planning while still sleeping in my bed at night. 5,000 here, 3,000 there, amounts small enough that I wouldn't notice but large enough to add up to serious money. I calculated that he'd moved almost $40,000 into this secret account over 6 months. Money that should have been ours becoming his war chest for the life he was planning without me. I spent those weeks moving through my days like a ghost, making breakfast for the kids, doing laundry, attending PTA meetings, all while my mind was screaming and my heart was shattered and my hands were gathering evidence that would destroy the man I'd loved for half my life. Michael asked me once if I was okay, said I seemed sad, and I smiled and told him I was just tired, that adulting was exhausting, and he laughed and went back to his video game. He was 14, still young enough to be self-absorbed, but old enough to sense when something was wrong. And I could see him watching me sometimes with confused concern, like he knew the weather was changing, but couldn't quite identify the storm. How do you tell your teenage son that his father is a lying cheater who's been building a whole new life behind your back? You don't. You just keep moving. Keep breathing. Keep collecting the ammunition you'll need when the war finally begins. You pack his lunch and ask about his math test and remind him to clean his room, and you don't tell him that you're planning the systematic destruction of his father's life, because that's a burden no child should carry. Emma was easier to hide it from because she was so busy with her own life, junior year of high school with all its pressures and dramas. She had SAT prep and violin lessons and a boyfriend named Jake who seemed nice enough, and she was so caught up in being 16 that she didn't notice her mother was falling apart. Or maybe she did notice and was afraid to ask, afraid of what the answer might be. Teenagers are smarter than we give them credit for. I was grateful for her self-absorption, for the shield of normalcy that her busy life provided, because I could pretend for her in a way I couldn't pretend for myself anymore. Chapter 4 arrived with the smoking gun, the piece of evidence so damning that even Frank's silver tongue couldn't talk his way around it. Sarah called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was grocery shopping, told me to sit down, and then sent me a video file. I stood there in the frozen food aisle of Whole Foods, my phone in my shaking hands, watching Frank and Melissa in what appeared to be her apartment. The video quality was surprisingly good, shot from across the street with a telephoto lens, showing them through a large window. and I had a split second to wonder about surveillance laws before the content made me forget about everything else. The audio was clear, too clear. Sarah must have had some kind of directional microphone, picking up their conversation about their future together, about how excited they were that soon he'd be free, that soon they could stop sneaking around. Melissa was wearing a silk robe, clearly nothing underneath, and Frank was in his boxers, the same boxers I'd bought him for his birthday last year. And the domesticity of it was somehow worse than the obvious sexual context. They were playing house, practicing the life they'd have together, using my money and my husband and my time to build their fantasy. Melissa asked when he was going to tell me, her voice high and young, with that slight vocal fry that marked her as a different generation, and Frank laughed, actually laughed, and said he was just waiting for the right moment, that he didn't want to hurt me, but he couldn't keep living a lie. The casual cruelty of it, the way he talked about me like I was an inconvenience instead of the woman who'd given up everything to build his perfect life, transformed something inside me. The sadness that had been weighing me down for weeks crystallized into something cold and hard and sharp. I watched him pull her close, kiss her neck, and tell her that soon they'd have everything they wanted, that he was setting up everything for a clean break. A clean break, like our 20 years together was a bone that could be snapped and set and healed with no lasting damage. I watched the video 3 times in that frozen food aisle, each viewing making me more angry and more focused, until a Whole Foods employee asked if I needed help, and I realized I'd been standing there for 15 minutes. I left the grocery cart in the middle of the aisle and drove home, my hands steady on the wheel for the first time in months. I wasn't sad anymore. I was angry, and anger is so much more useful than grief. I called the divorce attorney Sarah had recommended, a shark of a woman named Patricia Alvarez, who had a reputation for destroying cheating husbands in court. Patricia's office was in a glass tower downtown, all modern furniture and abstract art, and the kind of expensive minimalism that screamed success. Her assistant offered me sparkling water and asked me to wait, and I sat in a leather chair looking out at Lake Michigan and feeling my future rearranging itself. Patricia listened to my story, reviewed the evidence Sarah had compiled, and smiled like a predator scenting blood in the water. She was in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and she had the kind of confidence that comes from winning hundreds of cases exactly like mine. She told me we had an airtight case, that with the proof of adultery and financial misconduct, I could take Frank for everything he was worth. Illinois was a no-fault divorce state, she explained, but fault could still factor into property division and spousal support, especially when combined with evidence of marital waste using shared assets to fund an affair. But I didn't just want his money. I wanted his reputation, his standing in the community, the respect he'd built while using me as his foundation. I wanted everyone to know what he'd done, wanted his name to be synonymous with betrayal in every circle he moved in. Patricia understood. She'd been doing this for 30 years, and she knew that sometimes justice isn't about the settlement. It's about making sure everyone knows exactly who the villain is. She leaned back in her chair and asked me how far I was willing to go, and I looked her in the eye and said, as far as it takes. The shift from victim to strategist was intoxicating. Instead of crying myself to sleep, I started planning, thinking 3 steps ahead like I was playing chess against an opponent who didn't even know the game had started. Patricia outlined our strategy, explaining how we'd build the case, how we'd protect our assets, how we'd time everything for maximum impact. She told me stories of other clients, women who'd been where I was, and came out the other side not just okay, but thriving. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something that wasn't despair or rage. I felt hope. I opened my own bank account, transferred half of our joint savings before Frank could hide any more money, and started building my own financial independence. Patricia had advised me on exact amounts, what I could legally take without it looking like I was trying to defraud him, and I moved the money in 3 separate transactions to make it look like normal expenditures. I opened the account at a different bank than we normally used, one downtown near Patricia's office, and I walked out with a debit card that was mine and mine alone. access to money that Frank couldn't track or control or take away. I reached out to old contacts from my design days, started freelancing again, small projects at first, but enough to prove to myself that I still had marketable skills, that I wasn't just Frank's wife and the kid's mom, but Clara Johnson, a talented designer who'd put her career on hold but hadn't lost her edge. My first project was a logo redesign for a friend's new bakery. Barely paid anything, but I stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting it, feeling that old thrill of creating something beautiful and functional. The friend loved it, posted about it on social media, and suddenly I had 3 more people reaching out about small projects. Every small victory felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd given away without realizing I'd need it back. Chapter 5 was the masquerade. The weeks of pretending everything was normal while I methodically dismantled the life Frank thought he was building with Melissa. I smiled at him over dinner, asked about his day, laughed at his jokes, all while knowing exactly where he'd been and who he'd been with. The lying felt good, felt like justice, because for the first time in our marriage, I had the power, and he was the one in the dark. Patricia advised me to wait, to let Frank think everything was fine so he wouldn't start hiding assets or preparing his own defense. So I played the perfect wife, even initiated sex a few times to maintain the illusion. And if that makes me cold and calculating, then so be it, because war doesn't reward the honest, it rewards the strategic. The sex was strange, performative. I had to dissociate to get through it, had to pretend I was someone else doing something that didn't matter. I'd close my eyes and think about my strategy, about the evidence piling up, about the moment when I'd finally reveal that I knew everything. Frank seemed pleased that I was being affectionate, probably thought his gaslighting had worked and I'd gotten over my suspicious phase. He'd compliment me afterward, tell me he'd missed this, and I'd smile and agree and die a little more inside. There was one moment when I almost got caught, when everything nearly fell apart before I was ready. Frank came home early one afternoon and found me on my laptop reviewing the financial documents Patricia had requested. I barely had time to close the screen before he walked into the living room, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. The laptop was hot in my lap, the fan whirring loudly, and I was acutely aware of the papers spread across the coffee table, bank statements and credit card bills that I'd printed out to review. He asked what I was doing, and I told him I was looking at new kitchen designs, thinking about remodeling, because wouldn't that be nice? I gestured vaguely at the laptop, where I thankfully had a Pinterest board of kitchen ideas open in another tab, something I'd created weeks ago for exactly this kind of cover story. He bought it. Of course he bought it, because he'd gotten so comfortable with his deception that he couldn't imagine I was capable of my own. He kissed my forehead and said that sounded great, that we should definitely invest in the house, and I smiled and agreed while thinking about how that house was going to be mine, and he was going to be sleeping in a studio apartment, wondering where it all went wrong. After he left the room, I sat there shaking, adrenaline flooding my system, realizing how close I'd come to blowing everything. I gathered up all the papers and took them to my basement filing cabinet, made sure the laptop had a password he didn't know, and reminded myself to be more careful. Patricia had warned me about getting cocky, about letting my guard down, and I'd almost made a rookie mistake that could have cost me everything. The close call rattled me, made me realize how precarious my position was. If Frank found out what I was planning before I was ready to strike, he could drain our accounts, hide assets, make the divorce as ugly and expensive as possible. So I doubled down on the performance, became the wife he remembered from before, attentive and supportive and completely unthreatening. I cooked his favorite meals, asked if he wanted me to iron his shirts, suggested we take a weekend trip to Milwaukee, just the two of us, which he declined, claiming he had too much work. I asked about Melissa, casual questions about his colleagues that made him think I suspected nothing, and watched him lie to my face with increasing confidence. I'd say things like, "How's that marketing project going, the one with the outside firm?" And he'd tell me it was going great, that the marketing coordinator was very professional, very talented, and I'd nod and ask follow-up questions like I actually cared about the answer instead of collecting data about how easily he could deceive me. Each lie added fuel to the cold rage burning in my chest, the fury that kept me focused when grief tried to pull me under. I wasn't just fighting for a fair divorce settlement anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, my future, my right to not be discarded like yesterday's newspaper because I'd committed the crime of aging while married. I was fighting for every woman who'd ever been told she was too old, too much, too difficult, every woman who'd sacrificed her career and her identity and her dreams to support a man who repaid her with betrayal. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about sending a message that we didn't have to go quietly into the night, that we could fight back and win and make sure everyone knew exactly what had been done to us. Chapter 6 was about setting the trap, choosing the perfect moment for Frank's public destruction. Patricia suggested I wait until after the 4th of July party Frank's firm was hosting. A big networking event where all of Chicago's architectural elite would gather to drink champagne and congratulate themselves on their latest projects. Frank had been planning this party for months, had sunk significant money from the firm's budget into making it the social event of the season. It was supposed to showcase the firm's success, attract new clients, strengthen relationships with existing ones, and boost Frank's reputation as not just an architect, but as a leader in Chicago's business community. It was the perfect stage, Patricia said, the perfect audience to witness his humiliation. So I helped him plan it, suggested the caterer, and approved the guest list and picked out the perfect dress. A red number that made me look powerful and dangerous, and nothing like the frumpy middle-aged wife Frank had painted me as in his conversations with Melissa. The dress was designer, expensive, something I bought specifically for this occasion with money from my secret account. And when I tried it on in the boutique dressing room, I barely recognized myself. I looked fierce, untouchable, like someone capable of burning down everything and walking away without looking back. The weeks leading up to the party were surreal, like watching myself in a movie where I knew how it ended but had to sit through all the scenes anyway. I met with Patricia almost daily, finalizing our strategy, reviewing the evidence, preparing for every possible counter-move Frank might make. We had everything. The photos, the videos, the financial records showing thousands of dollars spent on his affair. We had testimony from Gary Mitchell, who felt terrible about his drunken slip at the barbecue and agreed to confirm that Frank had lied about the Napa Valley trip. Gary actually apologized to me, crying in Patricia's office, saying he'd had no idea, and if he'd known he never would have said anything at the barbecue, and I told him I was grateful, that his drunken comment had been the push I needed to stop being a victim and start fighting back. We even had emails between Frank and Melissa discussing their future together, planning the life they'd build after he left his old, boring wife behind. Sarah had managed to access Frank's personal email through methods she declined to specify, and the messages were damning, thousands of them going back 8 months. I spent an evening reading through them, torturing myself with the details of their relationship, the pet names they called each other, the inside jokes they'd developed, the plans they'd made for a future that required my erasure. Reading those emails was like drinking poison, each word burning as it went down, but I needed the pain to fuel what I was about to do. I also started building my own support network, reaching out to friends I'd neglected during my marriage, women who'd tried to stay close but gotten tired of me always putting Frank first. There was Rachel, who I'd met at the design firm and lost touch with after I left, and Jennifer from the kids' school, and Natasha from my old book club. They rallied around me with a fierceness that made me realize how much I'd isolated myself, how much of my identity I'd wrapped up in being Mrs. Frank Johnson instead of just Clara. We met for coffee and wine and long talks about everything I'd sacrificed and everything I was about to reclaim. They didn't judge me for the revenge I was planning. They encouraged it, shared their own stories of betrayal and rebuilding, and reminded me that I was stronger than I'd let myself believe. Rachel told me about her own divorce 5 years ago, how her husband had left her for his secretary in the most cliché betrayal possible, and how she'd rebuilt her life and was now running her own successful branding agency. Jennifer talked about staying in a dead marriage for 10 years for the sake of the kids, and how she finally left, and her kids thanked her for showing them that you don't have to settle for being unhappy. Natasha had never married, but had watched her mother stay with her cheating father for 40 years, and she was my biggest cheerleader, telling me to destroy him, to make him regret ever thinking he could discard me without consequences. You need people who see you, really see you, not just the role you play in someone else's story. These women saw me, saw my pain and my rage and my determination, and they reflected back an image of myself that was powerful instead of pathetic, a fighter instead of a victim. They helped me practice my speech for the party, timing it, suggesting edits, making sure every word would land with maximum impact. We rehearsed it until I could deliver it without shaking, without crying, with nothing but cold conviction and righteous anger. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Frank, listening to him snore, and thought about the 20 years we'd spent together. The good parts were real, I had to believe that. The laughter and the love and the building of our family. Our wedding day, dancing in the rain when the outdoor ceremony got caught in an unexpected storm, both of us laughing and soaking wet and not caring because we were young and in love and nothing else mattered. The birth of Emma. How Frank had held my hand through 23 hours of labor and cried when they placed her in his arms. Michael's first steps, taken toward Frank, who was kneeling on our living room floor with his arms out, calling our son forward. Family vacations and holiday traditions and quiet Sunday mornings, reading the newspaper together while the kids slept late. But somewhere along the way, maybe gradually or maybe all at once, Frank had decided it wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough, and instead of having the courage to be honest, he'd chosen deception. That's what I couldn't forgive, not the falling out of love, which happens, but the months of lying, the using of our shared resources to fund his betrayal, the casual cruelty of planning to discard me like I was disposable. I got up and stood at our bedroom window, looking out at the Chicago skyline glittering in the distance, and promised myself that no matter what happened tomorrow, I would never again make myself small to accommodate someone else's selfishness. I thought about putting on my wedding ring one last time, then decided against it. I'd stopped wearing it 2 weeks ago, told Frank I'd taken it to be cleaned and forgotten to pick it up, and he hadn't even noticed. That felt symbolic somehow, that the man I'd been married to for 20 years didn't notice when I stopped wearing the ring that symbolized our union. I looked at it now in my jewelry box, the simple platinum band we'd chosen together when we were young and broke and thought love was enough. I picked it up, felt the weight of it, remembered the girl who'd put it on with such hope and joy, and then I closed the box and walked away. Chapter 7, the climax, the event I'd been orchestrating for weeks, arrived with clear skies and temperatures in the low 80s, perfect weather for a rooftop party overlooking the city. Frank was nervous all morning, fussing with his tie and checking his phone and pacing around the house like a groom before his wedding. I wondered if he was texting Melissa, if they were planning their own private celebration after the party, if he had any sense at all of the bomb that was about to explode his entire life. I stayed calm, got my hair done at a salon on Michigan Avenue, took my time getting ready, and arrived at the venue looking like exactly what I was, a woman on a mission. The party was already in full swing when I walked in. Chicago's architectural community, drinking expensive wine and admiring the view and discussing their latest projects. The rooftop venue was stunning, all glass and steel and manicured plants, with the city spread out below like a glittering promise. White-coated waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A jazz trio played in one corner. And everywhere I looked, I saw successful people networking and laughing and having absolutely no idea what was about to happen. I saw Melissa immediately, standing near the bar in a tight black dress, looking young and beautiful and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. She was talking to another woman, both of them holding wine glasses, and I watched her laugh at something, watched her scan the room for Frank, watched her play the role of professional colleague while knowing she was sleeping with the host. Frank was across the room, holding court with a group of potential clients, and when he saw me, he smiled, actually smiled, like he was proud to have me there as his accessory. He gave me a little wave, gestured for me to come over, and I shook my head and pointed at the bar, mouthed that I was getting a drink. Patricia was already there, blending in with the other guests in a cocktail dress and heels, and she gave me a subtle nod. Everything was in place. The AV team had the presentation loaded and ready, the evidence curated and edited for maximum impact without crossing into anything that could be considered defamatory. We'd consulted with a media lawyer to make sure we weren't opening ourselves up to any lawsuits, and she'd assured us that truth was an absolute defense, that everything we were planning to show was documented fact. I waited until the speeches started, until Frank was at the microphone, thanking everyone for coming and talking about the firm's success and future plans. He looked so confident, so in control, master of his universe and architect of his own destiny. He talked about integrity and partnership and building something that would last, and I almost laughed at the irony. That's when I made my move, walking up to the small stage where he stood and taking the microphone from his hands. His face went from confused to alarmed as I gently but firmly pulled it away, but he was too stunned to resist, couldn't process what was happening fast enough to stop me. The room went quiet, confused, everyone looking at me with that polite concern people have when something unexpected happens at a formal event. I smiled, looked directly at Frank's pale face, and said into the microphone, "I have an announcement to make. Some of you may know me as Frank's wife, the woman who gave up her career and her dreams to support his ambitions. What you might not know is that for the past 8 months, Frank has been having an affair with Melissa Grant, the young woman standing by the bar looking like she wants to disappear." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible, a collective intake of breath as hundreds of eyes swiveled between me, Frank, and Melissa. I saw Melissa's face go white, saw her set down her wine glass with a shaking hand, saw her look around desperately for an exit. But I kept going, my voice steady, my hands not shaking, my heart pounding, but my mind crystal clear. I talked about the secret trips, the thousands of dollars spent on hotels and gifts, the emails planning their future together while Frank still came home to my bed every night. I didn't yell or cry or get emotional. I just stated facts, laid out the evidence like a prosecutor at trial, and watched Frank's face cycle through shock, anger, panic, and defeat. Behind me on a screen I'd had the AV team set up. Patricia's assistant began displaying some of the photographic evidence. Carefully edited to be embarrassing but not obscene, images of Frank and Melissa together that left no room for denial or explanation. Frank and Melissa holding hands on the Riverwalk. Frank and Melissa kissing in a parking garage. Frank and Melissa checking into a hotel. Each image stayed on screen for 5 seconds before dissolving into the next. A slideshow of betrayal set to the soundtrack of shocked whispers rippling through the crowd. Frank tried to take back the microphone, tried to laugh it off as some kind of misunderstanding, but his voice was shaking and his face was red, and everyone in that room could see the truth written all over him. He said, "Clara, this isn't the time or place," and I cut him off, leaning back into the microphone to say, "Then when is the time, Frank? When were you planning to tell me? Before or after you drained our bank accounts to fund your midlife crisis?" The crowd was in chaos now, people whispering and staring and pulling out their phones to record what would surely be all over social media by morning. Melissa had already fled, probably in the elevator heading down before the photos even started displaying. And I felt a moment of pity for her before remembering that she'd knowingly slept with a married man and helped him plan to abandon his family. Let her run, let her face her own consequences. I had bigger prey to hunt. The room was in chaos now, people whispering and staring and pulling out their phones to record what would surely be all over social media by morning. I could see Frank's business partners looking furious, probably calculating how much this scandal was going to cost them. I could see clients backing away, distancing themselves from the toxic situation. I could see the wives, the other women like me, looking at their own husbands with new suspicion and looking at me with something like awe. I looked at Frank one last time, This man I'd loved and trusted and built my entire adult life around, and said into the microphone, "I'm filing for divorce, Frank, and I'm taking everything. You wanted to feel young again? Well, enjoy starting over at 47 with nothing but your reputation in ruins and your name trending on Twitter for all the wrong reasons. The quotable moment, the line that would end up in comment sections and gossip columns and whispered conversations at every architectural event for the next year, I saved for last." I leaned into the microphone and said, "A man who throws away 20 years for a woman barely older than his daughter doesn't deserve the life his wife built for him," and walked off the stage to the sound of my heels clicking on the polished floor and the murmur of shock rippling through the crowd. Patricia was waiting for me at the exit with a satisfied smile, and as we left the building, I heard the party dissolving into chaos behind me, the social event of the season transformed into the scandal of the decade. Outside on the street, I finally let myself feel it, the triumph and the grief and the strange lightness of having finally stopped pretending. Chapter 8 was watching Frank's world collapse in slow motion, each day bringing new consequences for his very public betrayal. The story went viral, not just in Chicago architectural circles, but across social media, picked up by relationship blogs and Reddit threads and Twitter accounts dedicated to exposing cheaters. Someone had recorded my speech and posted it online, and within days I had women from all over the country reaching out to thank me for standing up for myself, for refusing to go quietly, for making sure Frank couldn't control the narrative of our divorce. The video had millions of views, thousands of comments, most of them supporting me and condemning Frank and Melissa. I became an accidental icon, a symbol of women fighting back against the betrayal and devaluation that comes with aging in a society that prizes youth above all else. His firm lost 3 major clients in the first week, corporations who didn't want to be associated with the scandal, and his partners called an emergency meeting to discuss his future with the company. Turns out that using firm resources to conduct an affair and potentially exposing the business to liability doesn't endear you to your partners, especially when it's all documented in emails and credit card statements. I heard through the grapevine that they were considering forcing him out, buying out his share, and removing his name from the firm he'd helped build. The firm had a morality clause in their partnership agreement, something Frank had insisted on years ago when one of the other partners was going through a messy divorce, and now that clause was being used against him. Melissa quit her job, probably couldn't stand the whispers and the stares, and from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, she and Frank had a spectacular breakup when she realized he wasn't the wealthy, successful man about to sweep her off to a glamorous new life, but a nearly broke architect facing professional ruin and a divorce that was going to cost him everything. Apparently, she'd been under the impression that Frank was much wealthier than he actually was, that leaving me would be a simple matter of signing some papers and riding off into the sunset. She hadn't realized that the house, the cars, the lifestyle she'd been enjoying on her dates with Frank, all of it was built on a partnership with me. And that partnership was about to be dissolved in a way that left Frank with significantly less than he'd started with. Frank tried to contact me, called and texted and even showed up at the house once, but I had changed the locks and refused to engage. I'd had new locks installed the day after the party, top-of-the-line security system, and the first time Frank tried his key and it didn't work, I watched him on the security camera trying it again and again, confusion turning to anger, turning to resignation. He rang the doorbell, pounded on the door, and I sat in the living room listening to him yell that we needed to talk, that I was being unreasonable, and I did absolutely nothing. Eventually he left, and I watched on the security footage as he walked back to his car, shoulders slumped, defeated. Patricia handled all communication through lawyers, and every attempt Frank made to negotiate or explain just dug his hole deeper. He wanted to talk about reconciliation, about how we could work through this, but that ship hadn't just sailed. It had sunk to the bottom of Lake Michigan, and I was already building a new boat. His lawyer sent a letter suggesting mediation, talking about preserving the family and considering the children. And Patricia responded with a letter listing all the evidence we had and suggesting that Frank should consider himself lucky we were keeping this in civil court and not pursuing criminal charges for financial fraud. The divorce proceedings were brutal and satisfying in equal measure. Patricia eviscerated Frank in depositions, confronting him with evidence of adultery, financial misconduct, and deceptive practices that violated our prenuptial agreement. We'd had a prenup, something Frank had insisted on when he started the firm, to protect his business interests in case of divorce. But the prenup had an infidelity clause, something I'd barely paid attention to when we signed it 20 years ago, assuming it would never matter because we were in love, and love was forever. The clause stated that in the event of proven adultery, the cheating spouse forfeited their right to a 50-50 split of assets and was subject to additional penalties. Frank had written it himself, never imagining he'd be the one it was used against. Illinois is technically a no-fault divorce state, but adultery can still impact property division and spousal support, especially when combined with proof that the cheating spouse used marital assets to fund the affair. We had everything documented, every dinner, every hotel room, every piece of jewelry purchased for his mistress while I was at home, raising his children and supporting his career. Patricia presented it all in excruciating detail, $40,000 in what the law calls marital waste, money spent on the affair that should have benefited the family. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd probably seen 1,000 cases like mine, looked at Frank with undisguised disgust and ruled in my favor on every single point. Frank's lawyer tried to argue that I was being vindictive, that I was only doing this for revenge, and Patricia's response, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, was that revenge and justice often looked identical when the person seeking it had been wronged this thoroughly. She pointed out that I was simply asking for what I was entitled to under both the law and our prenuptial agreement, that Frank's actions had consequences, and that those consequences were not my responsibility to mitigate out of some misguided sense of mercy. The financial settlement exceeded even Patricia's optimistic projections. I got the house, the majority of the retirement accounts, and spousal support that would maintain my standard of living while I rebuilt my design career. Frank's business had to buy out my share of his partnership stake at market value, which combined with everything else left him significantly less wealthy than he'd been when he started sleeping with Melissa. The judge also ordered him to reimburse me for the $40,000 in marital waste, essentially requiring him to pay back every penny he'd spent on his affair. Patricia had asked for this, not because we thought we'd get it, but as a negotiating tactic, and when the judge actually granted it, I saw Frank's face go gray. The kids, who were old enough to understand what their father had done, even if they didn't need to know all the details, chose to live primarily with me, visiting Frank on weekends in the modest condo he could now afford. Emma was devastated and angry, felt betrayed on my behalf and on her own behalf, and she told Frank in no uncertain terms that he destroyed her image of what a good man looked like. Michael struggled more quietly, internalized it the way teenage boys do, but he also made it clear that he was living with me, and Frank would have to earn back his respect. Watching him go from the master of his universe to just another divorced, middle-aged man, scrambling to maintain his lifestyle, would have been sad if I had any sympathy left. But that well had run dry somewhere around the 100th lie. He tried to apologize once, caught me picking up Emma from her violin lesson, and cornered me in the parking lot to say he was sorry, that he'd made a mistake, that he'd thrown away everything that mattered for something that turned out to be nothing. I looked at him, this man who'd shared my bed and my dreams and 20 years of my life, and felt absolutely nothing. No love, no hate, no anger, just a vast emptiness where all those emotions used to live. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like he'd lost more than just money and reputation, but some essential piece of himself that made him feel substantial. I told him I accepted his apology because holding on to resentment would only hurt me, but that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, and it definitely didn't mean I'd forgotten. He looked older then, diminished somehow. And I realized that karma wasn't some cosmic force that punished people. It was just the natural consequence of choices, and Frank had made his. I got in my car and drove away, and in the rearview mirror I watched him standing alone in the parking lot, probably finally understanding everything he'd lost. Chapter 9. The Aftermath and the Reconstruction. Started on a crisp October morning, 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I stood in my home office, the room I'd converted from Frank's old study, and looked at the design portfolio I'd been building. I'd painted the walls a soft gray, installed better lighting, filled it with plants and art, and all the things that made me feel creative and inspired. Frank's heavy mahogany desk was gone, replaced with a modern white workstation I'd designed myself. His leather chair was gone, replaced with an ergonomic one in teal that made me smile every time I sat in it. The room didn't smell like his cologne anymore. It smelled like coffee and paper and the eucalyptus candle I liked to burn while I worked. I had 3 steady clients now, small businesses needing branding and website design. Work I could do on my own schedule while still being present for Emma and Michael. The money was modest compared to what Frank used to bring home, but it was mine, earned through my own skills and effort, and that made it worth more than any joint bank account ever had. I was rebuilding not just my career but my identity. Rediscovering the woman I'd been at 25 before marriage and motherhood had reshaped me into someone else. She was still in there, that ambitious designer with big dreams, just older and wiser and significantly less willing to compromise herself for anyone. I'd also started teaching, a part-time position at a community college teaching basic graphic design, and I loved it in a way I hadn't expected. Working with students, mostly women returning to education after raising kids or leaving bad situations, felt like I was giving back, helping them reclaim their own identities and build their own independence. They looked at me like I was proof that it was possible, that you could start over at any age and build something new from the ruins of what you'd lost. My new tribe, the network of women I'd built in the aftermath of the scandal, became my anchor. We met weekly for coffee or wine, shared advice and opportunities, and the kind of honest friendship I'd been missing without realizing it. There was Sarah Chen, who'd gone from being my private investigator to being my friend, and Rachel from the design world, and Jennifer from the school, and Natasha from the book club. We called ourselves the Phoenix Club, women rising from the ashes of our old lives, and we supported each other through the hard days and celebrated the victories and reminded each other that we were more than our relationships, more than the roles other people had assigned us. We started a blog together, sharing our stories and advice for other women going through similar situations, and it grew faster than we'd expected. Women wrote in from all over the country, sharing their own experiences with betrayal and rebuilding, asking for advice, thanking us for making them feel less alone. We did a podcast, brought in guest speakers, created a whole community of women supporting each other through the worst moments of their lives and celebrating the best moments of their rebuilding. It gave me purpose beyond just my own recovery, made me feel like Frank's betrayal, as painful as it was, had led me to something meaningful and important. The kids adjusted better than I'd feared. Emma, 17 now, told me once that she was proud of me for standing up for myself, that watching me refuse to be a victim had taught her more about self-respect than any lecture ever could. She'd become more vocal about feminism, more aware of power dynamics in relationships, more determined to build her own career and identity before ever considering marriage. I worried sometimes that I'd made her cynical about love, but she assured me I'd just made her realistic, shown her that you could survive betrayal and come out stronger. Michael, 15 and still processing, was angrier at his father, but we were working through it in family therapy, learning to separate the man Frank had been as a father from the man he'd been as a husband. They spent weekends with Frank in his condo, came home with stories about his attempts to cook and his struggles to remember soccer schedules, and I tried not to feel smug about his incompetence at the domestic tasks I'd handled effortlessly for 2 decades. Part of me wanted them to see him fail, to understand what I'd sacrificed, but a bigger part just wanted them to have a relationship with their father, however flawed he was. Michael told me once, late at night when he came to say goodnight, that he understood why I did what I did at the party. He said he'd been angry at first, embarrassed that everyone knew our business, but now he got it, that Dad had forced my hand, that staying silent would have meant letting Dad control the story and make me the bad guy. He said he was proud to be my son, and I cried after he left, grateful that he understood, grateful that I was raising a man who would know better than to treat women the way his father had treated me. The legal victory was complete, but the emotional victory took longer. There were nights I still woke up angry, replaying old conversations and seeing manipulation I'd missed at the time, gaslighting so subtle I'd internalized it as my own inadequacy. There were moments I mourned not the man Frank turned out to be, but the man I'd believed he was, the partner I'd thought I'd chosen at 25 when I was too young and too trusting to see the red flags. But mostly I felt free, lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't know was there until I finally set it down. I went on dates, nothing serious, just testing the waters of who I might be as a single woman in her mid-40s, and discovered I actually liked myself, enjoyed my own company, didn't need another person to validate my existence or define my worth. There was David, a divorced dad I met at a coffee shop, nice enough but too eager to jump into something serious. There was Marcus, a colleague from the community college, smart and funny, but ultimately we had no chemistry. There was Karen, because I decided sexuality was something I could explore now that I wasn't defined by my marriage, and while we had a few nice dates, we were better as friends. I wasn't looking for another Frank, wasn't looking for anyone to complete me, because I was learning that I was already complete on my own. Now, let me share something important that I learned through all of this, something that might help if you or someone you know is in a similar situation. The pattern of behavior Frank exhibited is textbook narcissistic manipulation combined with what psychologists call economic abuse. He controlled the finances, made major decisions without my input, and used our shared resources to fund his affair while making me feel guilty for spending money on myself. The gaslighting, making me doubt my perceptions and question my sanity, is a deliberate tactic to maintain control and avoid accountability. Studies show that in 55% of cases involving infidelity, there's also emotional abuse, because the same lack of empathy that allows someone to cheat also allows them to manipulate and deceive without remorse. If you're reading this and seeing yourself in my story, here are the red flags to watch for. Financial secrecy, a partner who won't discuss money or share account information. Gaslighting, being told you're crazy or paranoid when you raise legitimate concerns. Isolation, slowly being cut off from friends and family who might provide perspective. And the most insidious one, the slow erosion of your identity and ambitions to support theirs. None of these things happen overnight. They build gradually, normalizing behaviors that in any other context you'd recognize as controlling or abusive. The key is to trust yourself, to believe your perceptions even when someone you love is telling you they're wrong, and to maintain your own financial independence and support network no matter how secure your relationship feels. Another thing I learned is the importance of documentation. If you suspect something is wrong, start keeping records. Save receipts, take screenshots, document conversations, create a paper trail that will protect you if things fall apart. I wish I'd started earlier. Wish I'd kept better records of all the times Frank gaslit me or lied to me, because even with all the evidence we had, there were moments in the divorce proceedings when it was his word against mine. Open your own bank account, even if it's just a small one, somewhere you can put emergency money that your partner doesn't know about. It's not paranoid, it's protective, and it could save your life if you need to leave quickly. And finally, know your worth. You are not too old, too much, too anything to deserve honesty and respect and love. The problem wasn't that I aged. It was that Frank was too immature to appreciate what he had, too selfish to communicate his unhappiness, too cowardly to end things honestly before starting something new. My age wasn't the problem. His character was the problem, and that's something I had to internalize before I could truly move forward. I'm 45, and I'm not too old for anything except tolerating disrespect and settling for less than I deserve. So here we are, at the end of this story and the beginning of my new life. I'm sitting in my home office in Chicago, the city I love, looking out at the autumn leaves falling in my backyard and thinking about everything I've survived and everything I've reclaimed. I'm 45 years old, single, rebuilding my career, raising 2 incredible kids, and finally living for myself instead of in service to someone else's dreams. The woman Frank left for his too-old wife turned out to be stronger, smarter, and significantly less willing to tolerate disrespect than he'd anticipated. I don't know what the future holds, but I know it's mine to shape. And that's worth more than any marriage ever was. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from? What time zone? What city? Does this story resonate with your experience, or have you witnessed something similar? Drop a like if you think I handled this the right way, and tell me in the comments what you would have done differently. Would you have confronted him privately or made it public like I did? Would you have tried to work it out or gone straight to the nuclear option? I'm curious to know your thoughts, your stories, your perspectives on betrayal and justice and rebuilding. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. I share stories like this regularly, tales of overcoming and empowerment and the messy reality of human relationships. There are 2 other videos on screen right now that you might find interesting. One about a woman who discovered her husband's secret family, and another about financial abuse in long-term marriages. Check those out when you're done here. Until the next story, remember to take care of your heart, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that you're too old, too much, or too anything to deserve respect and honesty. You are enough, exactly as you are, and anyone who doesn't see that doesn't deserve you. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.